What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. So if you're a Holy Paladin enjoyer, especially if you really only enjoyed that one class, you may have definitely been dooming over Miss Pandaria, because previously to the class tuning that we got, this spec was pretty much last on the list, was definitely not going to be in the meta compositions, and you're going to be pretty hard trolling your group to bring it in 10 and 25 man. However, Zirene has definitely brought us to the promised land. We're definitely huffing the hopium at this point. Holy Paladin post changes is definitely going to be a strong option for both 10 and 25 man. The buffs were very significant, and while shifting our playstyle more towards melee, make our mana just very comfortable, as well as bring Crusader Strike back up into the actual usable range of HPM. In terms of playstyle, Holy Paladin is going to be very melee-centric in MoP with the new changes. It's a pretty high APM playstyle. It's simple to learn, but it does have some cool opportunities for min-maxing as well. The spec brings very powerful, unique utility, plus an immunity, good defensiveness, very flexible CDs, both throughput CDs and damage reduction CDs on both the tank and the group. And while the caster playstyle is considerably worse post changes, the changes to our melee mechanics and Seal of Insight make the melee playstyle very comfortable, and again very forgiving on your mana, which is quite nice. While our lack of DPS will harm us significantly in challenge modes, we'll still easily be able to get gold times, and our very strong cooldowns as well as, tank healing will be very useful in that environment if you aren't pushing those super cutting edge times where the damage will be super significant. In PvP environments, while not quite as flexible or powerful as something like a Resto Druid or a Resto Shaman, it's quite similar to Mistweaver, where it is very strong in the comps that it can run, and your defensiveness and immunities and external cooldowns allow you to have a lot of play in PvP. Alright, so before we go through all the spells one by one, I want to go over some of the quick changes to passives and just our baseline toolkit that we get in Mists of Pandaria. Again, similar to all the other specs, we go to a choice row talent system in MoP, which means that a lot of the stuff we would otherwise have gotten in our talent trees, we now just get baseline to the spec. First of all, a quick mention here, Blessing of Kings and Blessing of Might are kind of similar to Cataclysm, where they're not like super unique or super valuable. The one thing to mention here is that Blessing of Might is changed to be the flat mastery buff that's new, as the attack power and MP5 buffs were removed. Having access to this mastery buff is quite nice because our mastery is very powerful in MoP. Seal of Insight now has the Glyph effect of 5% more healing just baked into it baseline, as well as the 10% haste buff we used to get from judging. Now we no longer have to judge to keep this up, it's just always up. This will also give us a chance to restore some mana. This is much more powerful than it was in Cataclysm. Much more similar to how it was in Wrath of the Lich King, where we're going to be much more focused on keeping melee uptime to generate lots of mana with this, as well as some incidental healing. Boundless Conviction is a very important one. What this will do is give us a cap of 5 holy power rather than 3. You can see here I can go all the way up to 5 before being overcapped. This is very useful, especially for Holy Paladin, because as a healer, we very frequently will want to pool our holy power and not spend it, waiting for an opportunity where we're going to do less overhealing. Whereas something like a Ret or Prot Paladin, you're just kind of more incentivized to just spend your spenders whenever you can. So this is both a huge quality of life buff, and also will increase our throughput a little bit, assuming you play it properly and, pool your spenders to where they won't overheal. Daybreak is completely redesigned in Mists of Pandaria. It no longer procs an extra holy shock off your casted heals. Instead, this will proc off of our radiance, and we'll stack up to 2 and just cause our Holy Shock to do a little bit of AoE healing, which is quite powerful. We'll talk about this more when we talk about our spells. Part of the Crusader, we no longer have Pony Aura at all. Instead, we just get a passive 20% mounted speed on us. This is really nice for personal mounted speed, but no longer having that aura is a little bit of a bummer. Holy Insight, this is just our passive that increases all of our healing and our mana pool for being in healing spec. The main thing here is that it gives us hit cap on all of our spells, as well as hit cap on Crusader Strike, although meaningfully this does not give us expertise cap on Crusader Strike, so we can still be dodged and parried, so we will want to be behind the boss when we're pressing Crusader Strike. Infusion of Light is very similar to how it previously worked in Cataclysm, however, it just no longer applies to Flash Heal, so you can see if I cast Flash Heal, it won't consume, whereas if I cast, Divine Light or Radiance, those will have their cast times reduced by 1.5 seconds. Our mastery is unchanged, it just gives us some absorb from our healing. However, because Radiance no longer has a hot portion, this will now apply to more of our healing overall, which is a big buff. Sanctity of Battle, this is a very important one for giving us haste scaling, as previously the only thing that gave us haste scaling was our hot from Holy Radiance. Now that's removed, and so instead of that we get this, which is going to reduce the cooldown of all of our builders, so things like Holy Shock, Crusader Strike, Judgment with Selfless Healer, those will have their cooldowns reduced with haste, so haste will give us more holy power over the course of the fight from those very efficient builder spells. Supplication is like a leveling thing where when you get a killing blow, your Flash of Light will always crit. not really useful in PvE. Tower of Radiance, we now get for free baseline, which is really nice, and it's a 100% chance here, so we get the full 3 talent version of this, where whenever we cast a heal, so if I put my beacon on myself and cast a Flash of Light or a Divine Light, I will just always get 1 Holy Power. This is very powerful, as Holy Power is super valuable, and will make it very efficient for us to do like direct healing into our beacon. So that's it. Those are all the real class changes, honestly. Not too much here. It's going to be very similar to Cataclysm. So if you have played the Cataclysm version of Holy Paladin, you won't be too jarred going to Mists of Pandaria. And even if you've played the retail Holy Paladin, it won't be too jarring. But if you have not played since, you know, Wrath or previous expansions, this will be quite different, obviously, with the whole Holy Power system. Alright, so now that we've gone through the introduction here, let's go through all the spells one by one. This is going to be a pretty short one because the basic toolkit of HPAL is like pretty small, it's pretty simple. Again, kind of similar to Cataclysm, which is nice. It's a pretty easy healer to learn how to play. However, again, there are some interesting like little min-maxy things you can do if you want to fully get 100% value out of the spec. So first off here, we do retain the 3 heal structure from Cataclysm with our Flash Heal, Flash of Light, our Greater Heal, Divine Light, and our like Heal button and Holy Light. These will function very, very similarly to how they did in Cataclysm, with Holy Light still retaining the 100% transfer through Beacon, so you can see if I heal someone, I'm going to get exactly the same amount through Beacon, whereas both Divine Light and Flash Heal both only have 50% transfer through Beacon. The ratios on healing per mana and healing per cast time are very similar to Cataclysm as well, with Divine Light being, you know, about 40% more efficient baseline, but 25% less healing per cast time. Whereas if you include Tower of Radiance Holy Power into the mix, Divine Light is only about 17% more mana efficient, where Flash of Light does like almost 35% more HPS. So we have a similar mechanism whereby if you want to do efficient spot healing, you're going to be using like Divine Light. Whereas if you want to do really, really mana efficient single target spot healing, that also, you know, is very high HPS, you want to be spamming your Flash of Light into a beacon target to generate that Holy Power. And in this case, it's actually like very, very slightly less mana efficient, but just much, much more HPS than Divine Light. So whereas in Cataclysm, you really wanted to have very few casts of Flash of Light in a fight to be correct. Now we're going to be casting this a little bit more than Divine Light. We're also going to be overall running a little bit less haste in my view for Holy Paladin, which means that Flash of Light's lower base cast time becomes much stronger. In Cataclysm and Wrath of the Lich King, the very long base cast time on Divine Light, which was Holy Light and Wrath, was less important because we ran so much haste. You know, if we run a little bit lower haste, the comparative advantage of being able to Flash of Light so quickly is going to make the spell a little bit better. Holy Light is actually not particularly mana efficient, and so we're basically never ever going to cast this button. You can effectively take this off of your bars for 3 reasons. 1, it's, again, very mana inefficient relative to previous versions of the game and also our other spells. 2, it interrupts our melee swing timer, which means we're going to get less mana and healing from Seal of Insight. And 3, because we're going to be running relatively lower haste in most builds, the HPS of Holy Light is just going to be terribly, terribly low. So in basically all situations where previously we would have been Holy Lighting, now we're just going to be sitting in melee Crusader striking to generate some Holy Power, and saving our mana for a more high impact spell like Divine Light or Flash Heal, or waiting to spot heal instead with, you know, a Word of Glory or an Eternal Flame. Next, I want to talk about our basic builder. So first we have Crusader Strike. You can see if I have no gear on, this has a 4.5 second cooldown. But you can see if I put my gear back on, it will go down to 4.29 just because of the amount of haste I have on my gear. This cooldown reduction is based on our melee haste, weirdly. So you can see, like, if I swap my Seal of Insight, my spell haste will go from 15% to 4.9, but my Crusader Strike will still have the same cooldown. This also applies to Holy Shock and Judgment as well. This also means that our Divine Favor, which will give us spell haste by 20%, does not actually affect these cooldowns, whereas Guardian of Ancient Kings will actually affect this because it's like global haste that's both melee and spell. So just kind of weird interactions there that are not intuitive. Just something to keep in mind that this is based off melee haste. So as I said before, Crusader Strike is hit capped baseline, but not expertise capped. However, we're not going to be worrying about expertise for this spell. It's still castable without it. So this spell is just our very basic melee filler that will do a little bit of damage based on our weapon, as well as generating 1 charge of Holy Power. You can see there that this does have a chance to proc Seal of Insight. Previous to the changes to Seal, this spell was actually not worth casting as it was less mana efficient even than just like Holy Radiance, which is our big juicy spammable AoE, and pretty comparable in HPM to something like Divine Light into your tower target. However, now post changes with Seal of Insight once again giving us mana, Crusader Strike is going to be very efficient. You can see with Eternal Flame, it's up here at almost 30 HPM. And even with LOD, it's still, 20, 21 HPM, which is quite serviceable. Still actually relatively close to Holy Radiance. However, the benefit of this is that it does not stop our melee swing timer, and our melee attacks also have a chance to proc Seal of Insight. Huge amount of our attacks are going to be proccing this seal, which will give us 3600 mana. So Crusader Strike is going to be very valuable for the times where we're in between big damage bursts. We don't need to do that much overall HPS, and we just want to be pooling some mana. So that's our first major filler. Again, the changes to Seal of Insight, making this actually castable again. Just a huge, massive buff to the spec overall, both play style, play pattern, as well as just raw throughput and mana. Another thing to mention here is that in Cataclysm with the Glyph, you get Crusader Strike down to the mana cost of Holy Shock. However, in this version of the game, it's just a little bit more expensive than Holy Shock, costing 7,200 mana, even post changes. Alright, so speaking of Holy Shock, let's talk about that next. This is a 4,800 mana cost spell, so very, very, very cheap. It has a 6-second base cooldown, which is again reduced by melee haste. You can see here I have 5.72 second cooldown. And in Mists of Pandaria, this spell just has a baseline 25% increased critical chance. So this previously was like a combination of Glyph plus some talent stuff. Now we just get 25% flat crit on this, which is incredibly powerful, not only for its healing, but also for its interaction with Infusion of Light, which is that whenever you crit on a Holy Shock, you'll get this buff, which will reduce the cast time of your next big heal by 1.5 seconds. So if we look at the HPM and HPCT of Holy Shock, its HPM is incredibly high, almost 60 HPM, so most efficient spell that doesn't rely on a talent choice by far, and even competing with some of our other talent choices here. The HPCT is actually pretty high as well, up at like 170k, so it's, pretty high up there, comparable even to like Holy Radiance. So very similar to Cataclysm, you really, really want to keep this on cooldown as much as possible. It's both very mana efficient and very high at healing per cast time, so even in those situations where the raid is taking very heavy damage and you really want to be spamming something like Holy Radiance, or, if a single target is taking heavy damage, and you're going to be spamming, Flash of Light into your beacon or something like that, you still want to always break to put your Holy Shock on cooldown because it's just a very, very, very strong spell. And haste reducing this cooldown is like the main driver behind our haste scaling. The cooldown on Crusader Strike is really not a huge deal for haste scaling, but Holy Shock, again, being such an efficient and powerful spell, being reduced by haste is going to be like the biggest driver, again, of that haste scaling. The value of our builders overall will somewhat be driven by which spender we choose to take, based on our talents, but we'll talk about this a little bit later, with Eternal Flame doing more healing per holy power than LOD. So those are our two basic pillars. Judgment does not grant a holy power baseline for Holy Paladin. However, we can take a talent row option, which will cause it to generate holy power, in which case this will also be part of our basic builder rotation. However, for Eternal Flame and Sacred Shield playstyles, you will just never press Judgment. Again, the buff that this used to provide in Kata and Wrath of the Lich King that would give you some spell haste no longer comes from Judgment, it's just baseline in your seal, so you don't have to press this. Alright, so the last spell I want to talk about here is our only AoE mana spender, Holy Radiance. So whereas in Cataclysm this spell was just disgustingly overpowered, having a 30-second cooldown for the entirety of the expansion previous to Dragon Soul, having that cooldown removed but not really being rebalanced to make up for that, this spell was just disgusting in last patch for its balancing in Cataclysm Classic. Now it's fully redesigned and it's actually balanced around not having a cooldown, so the spell is a lot weaker than it was in Cataclysm. It's also significantly reworked in Mist to no longer have a hot portion, so again, it won't scale with haste. What this does is heals the target for a high amount and then 6 players within 10 yards of that target for 50% of that amount. So you can see if I press it on this guy, it's going to do 19k to him and then 10k to other players around him within 10 yards. The nice thing about the removal of the hot from this is that now 100% of its healing will scale with our mastery. So you can see if I just spam this on him, the direct heal will give him mastery and the AoE will give us mastery. So where previously 40% of the healing of our main AoE filler spell, which was most of our healing in Cataclysm, just did not scale at all with mastery, but did scale with things like crit and haste. Now, all of our spells will scale with both crit and mastery, which is really, really nice. One thing to mention about the tooltip here, while this says healing effectiveness is diminished for each player beyond 6, it actually just means it's capped. So it's technically true as doing 0 healing beyond 6 is technically diminished. It's just a little bit unclear. So this, similar to Sanctuary and Healing Rain, was changed in 5.4 to just smart heal 6 targets and be capped. And this also was changed in 5.4 again to not target guardians or pets. The final interaction here is with Daybreak. So again, as I said before, Daybreak is totally reworked in Mists of Pandaria. This will proc off of every single Holy Radiance, so there's no like chance here, just every time you cast Holy Radiance you'll get a Daybreak, and this will stack up to 2. So you'll see if I press Holy Radiance twice, I'll get Daybreak, and then I'll get a second charge of Daybreak. What this will do is cause the next Holy Shock you cast to heal every single ally within 10 yards of the person that you shock, or 75% of the original healing done, and again this stacks twice, so 150%. So you can see if I generate a stack of Daybreak on myself and only have one player in range, if I heal myself, it's going to do 26k to me, and then 75% of that, about 20k onto this player. However, if I have more players in range, it's going to split that healing, so just fully splitting, there's no like extra scaling here, so instead of one player getting 20k there, we had each player getting 10k. One really nice thing about Daybreak is that you can see if I have some mastery on myself and some mastery on the target, and I do Daybreak, it's going to refresh the mastery as well as adding whatever healing value you did to that mastery for every single player in the radius. So even though it's like hard capped and just split evenly, even if you have all 25 players in the raid and your Daybreak is only hitting each player for, a few hundred healing, it's going to refresh your mastery shield on every single player. So if you're spamming a lot of Radiance on the raid, maybe you're doing some overhealing, you're, pressing LOD, generating lots of stacks of Absorb, your Daybreak on that stack is going to very effectively refresh all that mastery duration and just reduce the amount of overhealing your Absorbs will do very significantly, and reduce the amount of them that will time out without being fully effective. And because we're wanting to spam Holy Shock anyways, it's really basically free healing, right? You're just always going to spend your Daybreak procs, and you're never going to overcap. However, it is important to remember not to cast Holy Radiance more than twice in a row without a Holy Shock in between. So that's it. That's like our whole main spell toolkit. So now before we talk about our spenders, I want to quickly go over the changes to Beacon of Light. First of all, this now has no mana cost baseline, which is really nice. You can swap this basically at no cost. Still has a 60-yard range, and now has a 3-second cooldown, which is going to be relevant when we talk about the Glyph of Beacon later on. So some nice quality of life changes there, as well as a slight throughput increase with the no mana cost. This will still duplicate Holy Light at 100%, again, that I talked about before, plus 50% of Flash and Divine Light. The major change here is that some spells that are categorized as AoE will now transfer through the beacon at 15% value rather than 50%. So most meaningfully here is Holy Radiance, which will transfer through 15%. You can see there if I heal, I hit 3 targets and I got 3 beacon procs, but for a very small amount. This does not apply to Daybreak. You can see when I just Daybreak there, I didn't get any transfer from the 30k, only from the initial Holy Shock hit. The third most important thing here is Light of Dawn. So Light of Dawn now transfers at 15% instead of 50%. However, the overall healing is still quite strong. It's just shifted from Beacon towards healing and mastery. So a little bit of a different healing profile there, whereas in Cataclysm, Light of Dawn was an incredible tank heal through the Beacon. Now it's mostly going to be shifted towards that AoE healing as well as mastery on the raid. Lastly, Beacon will transfer some of our talent spells that are also like coded as AoE at 15% as well, which is quite nice. So that's Beacon. Now let's go into spenders. We'll do Light of Dawn first since we just talked about it. So this is, again, pretty much unchanged from Cataclysm, other than the fact that instead of transferring through Beacon at 50%, it now transfers at 15%. The other main change to this is that instead of being a frontal that like affects a rectangle in front of you for, I think it was 25 yards, now it just AoEs around us for 30 yards. You can see even the visual is now up instead of forward. So you don't have to aim this anymore, and it's a lot easier in basically any situation in Raid to just always hit 6 targets. Even in 10-man, the likelihood that you don't have 6 players within 30 yards of you radially is very, very low. So definitely a buff there to its range and radius. However, the change with Beacon is not necessarily a buff, just a shifting of the healing profile away from Beacon and towards direct healing and mastery. Our second baseline Holy Power spender is Word of Glory. This is the single target to our LOD's AoE. However, similar to Cataclysm, this spell is just like very weak baseline compared to LOD in terms of its overall healing. So in non-eternal flame specs, we're going to be very rarely using Word of Glory, basically in circumstances only in which LOD is going to like massively overheal where you consider using this. If you look at the healing per Holy Power, LOD is like almost 80% better than Word of Glory. And so unless you're overhealing at a very high percent with your LOD, you don't want to be using WOG. Also, if you do have to WOG, you really want to prioritize non-beacon targets, because if you hit your beacon with your WOG, you're going to be missing all this healing, which is, like 28% of the whole healing of the spell. So 28% off this number is like even worse than LOD. And if we do have to like direct heal or spot heal our beacon target, it's much better to just use a flash of light or a divine light than it is to waste your holy power on a much less efficient spell like Wog. Again, we just want to direct heal with the flash of light, generate a holy power, and then use that holy power to press LOD, which is going to be, 70-80% more effective. The only time Word of Glory is going to be like overall better than a Light of Dawn is if it's only going to heal 2 of the targets it hits. In this situation where we're only hitting 2 targets with LOD, Word of Glory is going to be more efficient if it doesn't overheal. But this is such a rare circumstance, and again, because we have 5 holy power now, we can much more easily just pool our holy power and wait for an opportunity for LOD to be good, rather than, rushing to spend our holy power on Word of Glory and being very inefficient that way. So those are our 2 baseline spenders. Again, very, very similar to Cataclysm. We have another spender in Eternal Flame, which will replace Word of Glory if we do choose to take this talent, but I'll save talking about that for later when we do talk over talents. The last thing to mention for spells here is Denounce. This is our damage button. It does a not totally insubstantial amount of damage, but quite low compared to other specs like, Holy Priest, Discipline Priest, Mistweaver, all that stuff. So pressing this for damage specifically is really not a great idea outside of like very huge damage amps to the boss when there's basically no healing to be done. It does have the preventing critical strikes from the target for 4 seconds effect, but this is, basically only for PvP. When it comes to our melee damaging abilities, both Crusader Strike and Judgment just do very minimal amounts of damage. Holy Shock does a decent little chunk of damage. It's about the same amount as the Denounce. So if you're like fully gonna overheal with a Holy Shock and you don't care about the Mastery Shield, you can always send it for damage and just to generate some holy power. We no longer have Consecration, which is, not great for our AoE. And if we want to swap to something like Seal of the Righteous or Seal of Truth, we're going to be losing all the mana and healing we get from Seal of Insight, which is terrible. So generally speaking, our damage is going to end up very low, and it's really not like important to play for damage on a Holy Paladin. We really just want to maximize our melee uptime for mana gained and optimize our HPS. Finally, when it comes to damage, Hammer of Wrath here is kind of an interesting one. It's basically free, right? It only costs 2,000 mana, so very, very, very low impact on our healing. Doesn't generate a holy power in Mists of Pandaria, but it does a, not totally insubstantial amount of damage, so if you have fully empty globals in Execute, you can always use this to just contribute a very small amount of damage to the boss, but it's very low priority and I wouldn't worry too much about it. Alright, so those are our spells. Now I'm going to go over our cooldowns really quickly here. I'm going to start with the throughput cooldowns and then end with the defensives, utility, stuff like that. So first of all, we still retain Divine Favor, which is a 3-minute cooldown, which will increase our spell haste by 20% and our spell critical chance by 20% or 20 seconds. So pretty high uptime, but on a 3-minute CD. Again, that spell haste does not interact positively with our cooldown reduction because it's not melee haste. So really we're getting the 20% crit, and the 20% haste is just like a burst throughput increase. It doesn't actually increase our healing per cast on any of our spells, other than Eternal Flame Hot if we do make a breakpoint with this Divine Favor. Secondly, we have Wings or Avenging Wrath. This is a 3-minute in Mists of Pandaria, and just increases all damage and healing caused by 20% for 20 seconds. This being a 3-minute means we can line it up with Divine Favor perfectly to get a very powerful window of 20% healing, 20% crit, 20% haste, which will allow us to just really pump huge amounts of HPS. The thing with this though is that it does require us to actually use our rotation properly, unlike something like a Divine Hymn from a Holy Priest or a Healing Tide Totem from a Shaman, which are just one button that will automatically smart heal everyone in the raid for you. If we do pop these and we aren't rotating properly, we aren't spending our holy power properly or targeting people properly, the throughput of these cooldowns will become much less impactful. Next we have Guardian of Ancient Kings. This has actually changed pretty significantly from Cataclysm, where it was a 5-minute cooldown. Now it's 3, so 2 minutes off the cooldown. This also used to have like a charge limit in Cataclysm of the amount of heals it could double. Now it's just like uncapped. Anything you cast within the 15 seconds will get doubled. It also used to splash for, I believe, 10% of the amount healed. Now what it will do is just duplicate the heals you deal and also give you 10% both spell and melee haste for its duration. So meaningfully, this haste will actually scale our cooldowns. It also still summons the little helpful angel guy, which is kind of cool. So another really powerful 3-minute here. So again, if we do choose to stack all these cooldowns on top of each other, we're going to be getting doubled healing with 10% haste, 20% spell haste, 20% crit, plus this 20% modifier. So we can have a incredibly powerful 3-minute window if we so choose, or we can spread these cooldowns out to get more coverage. You can also see here that the language of the duplication is different. It says Your Guardian will heal the targets of your heals for an additional 100% of the amount healed, and grants you 10% haste for its durations. So you can see here, I cast a Radiance with my Guardian out. It healed one player for 20k, the second player for 10k, and then, 2.5, 1.5k here through the beacon. And my Guardian actually duplicated each one of these heals 100%. So this is pretty important. Previously, it would only duplicate single target heals and then give you that 10% value as splash. Now it will just duplicate all your healing, including beacon. One last mechanical quirk of Guardian to mention here, which is very important actually for Eternal Flame playstyles, is you can see if I generate some holy power here and put an Eternal Flame on myself, you can see I'll have this hot taking on me. If I summon my Guardian, you can see that the Guardian will not duplicate the existing hot, and if I cast another Eternal Flame on somebody else, you can see that the Guardian will duplicate the initial heal, but will have no interaction with the hot. It won't like cast a second hot on the target, and it doesn't even duplicate the hot that I cast while it was up. So Guardian not interacting with Eternal Flame hot healing at all means that it's going to be favorable for Selfless Healer and LOD focused playstyles, as it will affect all the direct healing and the beacon healing that LOD does, whereas Eternal Flame, a huge portion of its healing being that hot, is going to benefit from it slightly less. One last thing to mention here is that if I summon my little angel friend and do a heal on myself, you can see this Divine Light's going to hit for like 46k plus the other 46k, so about 100k, but my Mastery Shield is only 8500, and so my Mastery being about, 16% unbuffed, this means that the healing from my angel friend just does not proc Masteries. So this means that despite the fact that it says it doubles, it's going to be a little bit less than doubling because we don't benefit from that Mastery. You can see this will also duplicate spenders like, LOD and Word of Glory. So a very powerful and much more flexible now heal. So those are our baseline throughput cooldowns. We have some more options in the talent row which allow us to get more cooldowns or power up our existing cooldowns, which we'll talk about later. When it comes to defensive cooldowns, we have Devotion Aura. This is a 3-minute cooldown. It's kind of like our version of DSAC in Mists of Pandaria. With the changes, this now affects all damage, not just magic damage, and it has a radius of 40 yards, so very, very wide radius, 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds. This is going to make us kick immune in PvP, which is quite nice, and in PvE, this is just an incredibly flexible damage reduction cooldown. Doesn't matter if the rate is spread or stacked, it still works. And the change of this affecting all damage types and not just magic means we're just way, way more flexible, especially in 10-man where you're very limited on cooldowns. This makes Holy Paladin a much more like one-to-one replacement for other healer cooldowns like Barrier and Spirit Link. Next we have Divine Protection. This is nerfed from Cataclysm. It's no longer a 30-second cooldown. It's a 1 minute now, but honestly it was incredibly overpowered in Cataclysm, so this is a totally reasonable nerf. It now also has the 40% magic damage baseline, and the Glyph will instead make it 20% Fizz and magic. So this is nice. This is the option we usually would take in raid anyway, so getting this without a Glyph slot is an upgrade. We of course have Bubble, which is our 8-second immunity on a 5-minute. Our hands are mostly unchanged. We have Hand of Freedom. We still have Bop, which is a 5-minute cooldown. This is actually quite useful in a lot of MoP raids to like immune off physical debuffs and stuff like that, both on the tank and on players, as well as just to like immune physical damage. There's quite a bit of physical raid damage in a lot of MoP raids, and this is still unique to the Paladin class, not Holy Paladin unique, but every additional Paladin you bring to your raid, especially the first one, getting this Bop is going to be really nice. We still have Hand of Sack, which is like our tank external 30% DR for 12 seconds on a 2-minute, very, very strong. Hand of Salve, a lot less useful in MoP because threat doesn't really exist, but still, just there as a placeholder, I guess. We still have our melee cooldown Kick, which is quite nice for dungeons and even sometimes in raid. And finally, we do retain Lay on Hands, which will just heal a target for our maximum HP on a 10-minute CD. So those are our baseline cooldowns, and again, we do have lots of talents and glyphs which will modify and improve the effectiveness of these cooldowns. Alright, so speaking of talents, let's start going through those here. Our 15 row is going to be all movement, speed, mobility stuff. The first option is Speed of Light. This has a very small mana cost, a 45-second cooldown, and just increases our movement speed by 70% for 8 seconds, so a nice little sprint here. It's definitely no feathers, but it's a nice option. Long Arm of the Law is kind of interesting for Selfless Healer playstyle where you're going to be pressing Judgment quite a bit. It just gives you a 45% sprint for 3 seconds after you judge. The last option here is Pursuit of Justice. You get 50% MS just at all times, and 5% more for each charge of Holy Power, up to 3. So with 3 charges of Holy Power, if we just get 3 charges healed really quickly, you can see that our buff goes all the way up to 30% MS. You can see here just a very quick breakdown. Speed of Light is going to be like 8% MS on average, so pretty bad average uptime, but when you do need it, it's going to be up in 70% a lot. Also, the mana cost, if you press this on cooldown, it's going to be like 1000 HPS loss just from the mana cost, which is, again, pretty insignificant. Long Arm, if we have like a decent amount of haste, is going to have like a 60% uptime, which means we're going to get, you know, almost 30% movement speed on average from this, which is really, really high. So again, for Selfless Healer playstyle, I think Long Arm is actually a pretty good option. The problem with this is that if there's no enemies to judge, you can't put this up. So if the boss goes immune or like between trash packs or something like this, you're getting no benefit from this. Pursuit of Justice is, I think, going to be the best option generically, because if you have like on average 2 Holy Power, you're going to be getting 25% move speed from this, which is really powerful. Next we have our 30 row, which is going to be crowd control PvP stuff. Fist of Justice just reduces the CD of our Hodge by 30 seconds. Repentance is a 15-second cooldown, 1.5-second base cast time. This gives us a castable crowd control effect. It has a 30-yard range now, which is quite powerful for, again, arenas. Our last option here, Evil as a Point of View, is of course a Star Wars reference talent. This will make our turn evil able to fear humanoids and beasts. So really, like in PvP, you're just kind of picking which one doesn't BR with your teammates in arenas. Our 45 row is our first and potentially even most impactful throughput row. What spell we choose to take here is going to dramatically alter our playstyle and play patterns. Let's start first with Selfless Healer. What this will do is cause our Judgment to generate a charge of Holy Power. Just that in itself would not be that powerful. Judgment has a similar mana cost to Crusader Strike, but does not proc Seal of Insight. So its mana cost is like effectively a little bit higher. So just the charge of Holy Power, you know, again, would not really be super worth it, but the main effect here is the buff that this gives you. So what this buff will do is it affects all 3 of our like big juicy mana spender spells, Flash of Light, Divine Light, and Holy Radiance. And per stack, this stacks up to 3, will give 35% reduced cast time and mana cost. So at 3 stacks, it makes the spell completely free, and it also improves its effectiveness by 20% per stack. So at 3 stacks, you're getting 60% more healing on one of those spells. Generically, we're going to be using this to do really, really juiced up, you know, radiances. However, you can also use this for very powerful spot healing with a Divine Light and Flash of Light. Because Divine Light has a higher base healing and like scaling, you generically want to be spending this if you have like 2 or more stacks on a Divine Light to spot heal, because, you know, Flash Heal has a shorter cast time baseline, but does less healing. So because each stack of Judgment gives you like a third off of the cast of a Holy Power generator, each cast is going to give you like effectively 1.33 Holy Power. 3 stacks also gives you, you know, like 160% of a DL or a Radiance for free, which means that each cast is going to give you like about half of a Divine Light or Radiance. And so all this combined makes like Judgment, if you spend it on a Radiance, have about like a 42 HPM. So it's actually close in HPM to Holy Shock, and far, far better, you can see, even than Crusader Strike with EF, and its healing per cast time is similarly quite high. So with all these modifiers stacked up together, Judgment just becomes very, very, very powerful, and it becomes super important for us to be pressing this on cooldown, similar to Holy Shock. The reduction in cast time also gives us a little bit of mobility, meaning that we can, you know, cast our Radiances and our Divine Lights on the move. Next, let's go to Eternal Flame. This is an interesting one. It will completely replace your Word of Glory and do exactly the same amount of direct healing, but it will also put a 30-second hot, so very, very long duration hot on the target that will tick every 3 seconds. This is also affected by haste and will gain extra tick, so this gives us a little bit more haste scaling. And post changes, this hot is affected by mastery, so you can see as it ticks, it's going to not only refresh my illuminated healing, but also add, you know, whatever 20% of the tick to my illuminated healing. So similar to Daybreak, this is actually really nice for blanketing Absorb and keeping that Absorb constantly refreshed so it doesn't overheal or time out. This effect of refreshing illuminated healing for 30 seconds also does work even if the Eternal Flame is only 1 Holy Power. So even if it's super weak, you know, that hot will still be on there for 30 seconds, refreshing all your mastery. So even in a 25 man where it's going to be harder to get coverage, or in a 10 man if you have like a little bit lower haste or lower Holy Power generation, you can blanket the raid in 1 power Eternal Flames, and in this way we can generate raid-wide shielding. However, our blanket absorbs are going to be just much less efficient than something like a Discipline Priest, and even Selfless Healer can do a similar thing by just blasting LODs and Radiances and Divine Lights into targets, and then refreshing that Absorb shield with Daybreak procs. If we compare Eternal Flame as a spender to LOD and Word of Glory, it's obviously just strictly superior to Word of Glory, doing exactly the same direct healing, but also adding this hot on top. And compared to LOD, it's actually significantly more healing per holy power, to the tune of, about 40% more healing. It also has a significantly different profile compared to LOD, with doing so much direct healing, and with these hots transferring through Beacon at 50%. So you can see if I put the hot up on the guard, it's going to transfer through Beacon at 50% power. This means that Eternal Flame is going to be heavily weighted towards Beacon healing, and it's going to do a lot less mastery than LOD, even though the hot does now proc mastery. So if we just compare their estimated healing profiles, the top here being Selfless Healer and the bottom being Eternal Flame, we can see their, overall HPS is quite similar, within a few thousand HPS, but with Eternal Flame doing almost double the Beacon healing, slightly less absorb overall, and slightly less direct healing. I also made a chart here to estimate the amount better that EF is versus LOD based on overhealing percentage. So you can see this axis over here is just our direct overhealing, and this axis is Beacon overhealing. You can see that as our direct healing goes up and up and up, EF gets dramatically better than LOD, but if our overhealing on Beacon gets high, LOD is going to become much closer. However, even at 80% Beacon overhealing, LOD is still worse healing per healing power than Eternal Flame. Another thing to mention with Eternal Flame is that because the Eternal Flame itself does so much more healing per holy power, and so much more of our healing is going to be coming from spenders in Eternal Flame style, this means that spells like Crusader Strike are going to become much more efficient when they're used to press EF rather than LOD. So you can see here that, our Crusader Strike with EF is 28 HPM, whereas with LOD it's only 20. This also holds true for Holy Radiance, as well as our Divine Light and Flash of Light into our tower. One consequence of Crusader Strike being so good for Eternal Flame, plus, our inability to generate holy power and value with Judgment, means that Eternal Flame is actually punished much more for not being able to be in melee range. Whereas Selfless Healer can kind of stand out and do a more caster-focused style, just pressing Holy Shock and Judge on CD. The only thing you really miss being at range is the mana from your Seal of Insight, and, Crusader Strike is really not that powerful if you're spending it on LOD, whereas for Eternal Flame, if you're out, you're missing both the holy power from your Crusader Strike as well as that mana. And because we don't have Judgment, which is a second super mana efficient spell to press, EF is also more reliant on mana, so it kind of gets a double whammy from not being in melee range. So on any fight where you cannot consistently have high melee uptime, Selfless Healer is going to dramatically pull ahead, whereas on fights where you can be in melee and you really do value that high Beacon healing, Eternal Flame is going to be very attractive. Lastly, we have Sacred Shield. You'll be familiar with this if you did play in Wrath of the Lich King, however the Mists of Pandaria version is a little bit different. When you press it on a player, it will instantly apply a small absorb, so you can see I press it on myself, I'll instantly get an absorb for about 15k in my current gear. It will also put the Sacred Shield buff on that player. This is a 30-second long buff. Every 6 seconds, this will put up the same value of Absorb Shield again. This effect will also gain extra ticks from haste, similar to other hot effects. However, the 6-second long Absorb buff does not get refreshed or increased in value, similar to our Mastery. Every single time you get a new tick of this, it will just overwrite the previous buff. So as you get more and more ticks, the actual duration you have to get full value out of the Absorb goes down, which is a little bit odd. However, in most situations, you should be getting full value out of the Absorb anyway, so this won't negatively affect your overhealing too much. The 10-second recharge and 30-second duration means we can keep this active on 3 targets. Generally speaking, you're going to be putting this up on the main tank and the off tank, and then some other player who's taking some consistent damage. And because this is all absorb, it should have relatively low overhealing in most environments. This spell does have a mana cost, which again you can't see because of the bug tooltips on beta. It costs about 10,000 mana, and a big problem with this spell is just that it's not very high HPM. It's only 26, so it's actually worse than Crusader Strike with EF. It's worse than Judgment, it's worse than Holy Shock. It's just barely better than Holy Radiance with EF. If you look here at our estimated sim, the overall HPS for Sacred Shield is 155k, meanwhile Selfless Healer is 190, and EF is about 184, so a huge overall HPS increase. And, ideally you'd say we'd be getting a huge amount of Absorb increase from this because Sacred Shield is so focused on Absorb, and because that Absorb is going to be much lower overhealing, maybe we get some effective value here, but honestly, we don't actually get that much Absorb value from this. For example, our Eternal Flame sim here is estimating about 28,000 HPS of Absorb, and our Selfless Healer is estimating about 31,000 HPS in Absorb. Meanwhile, our Sacred Shield is only about 45,000 Absorb. And both our Beacon and Direct Healing are just far lower than the other two options. So we're losing, you know, like 22% overall HPS for like 45% more absorb healing. So in order for Sacred Shield to be powerful, we'd have to be doing very, very high levels of overhealing. And because we can only Sacred Shield 3 targets, this means that primarily it's going to be on the tanks, and in an environment where the tanks need a lot of focused healing, something like EF is going to be much better because it's going to be doing more than double the amount of beacon healing and direct healing while not losing too much in absorb. So what this all means is I really don't see any reasonable use cases for Sacred Shield. You are basically just going to be picking between Selfless Healer and Eternal Flame. Generically, I would say that Selfless Healer is going to be doing a little bit more raw HPS, again, a little bit more focused towards direct healing and mastery healing, whereas Eternal Flame is going to be able to pre-shield a little bit more effectively overall, especially in 10-man environments. It's going to do a lot more beacon healing, which is going to make your tank feel extremely safe. However, the overall HPS between these two options is close enough that you can kind of just pick based on personal preference. Our 60 row has some very, very powerful utility options. Our first option here is Hand of Purity. This is a very, very odd spell. It's a 30-second cooldown, costs a tiny amount of mana, and it reduces damage on the target by 10%, and damage from harmful periodic effects by an additional 80%, so that's 90% total. This will only reduce damage that like can't be immuned off by I think 30 or 40%. So some effects in raid, which you can't bubble off, will be reduced at a lower rate than this. This is like very, very, very niche usable on some fights where there's big dots. For example, on Amber Shaper, if you have DPS that are zug-zugging, standing in all the smart healing, and get really, really high stacks of that dot, you can put this on them for the last 6 seconds and reduce that dramatically. However, for the most part, we're going to be taking one of the second two options, generally speaking the last one. Next is Unbreakable Spirit. This reduces the cooldown of our Divine Shield, Divine Protection, and Lay on Hands by 50%. So this puts our shield wall back to 30 seconds that it was in Cataclysm, which is a huge tankiness increase. Also makes our bubble 2.5 minutes, so on some fights where maybe we need to immunity very frequently, we can use this. Also, the Lay on Hands is going to be a slight throughput increase. So on like a 6-minute fight, this is going to be, maybe 0.6% HPS increase if it gives you 2 uses of LOH. However, in any fight less than 5 minutes, it's going to be useless. The most impactful talent here, though, by far is going to be Clemency. It says you can use Hand of Freedom, Hand of Protection, Hand of Sack, and Hand of Salve twice each before incurring their cooldowns. So you can see here when I take this, I get these like 2 charge counters on my hands. Mostly in PvE environments, you're going to be using this to get Hand of Sack and Bops. Getting 2 30% on the tank or on a player that has some kind of single target damage happening on them is just incredibly, incredibly powerful, as well as being able to double bop off physical debuffs or immune physical damage. So despite the fact that Unbreakable Spirit is a very, very powerful personal defensiveness option plus a slight amount of HPS, Clemency is just going to be your default choice and you're almost never going to unspec this. Our 75 row is our next throughput row. While not as playstyle warping as 45, we do have some pretty important options here. Our first 2 are going to be based on cooldowns, and our last one is going to be passive. The first option here is Holy Avenger. This is a 2-minute cooldown that lasts 18 seconds, so a relatively high uptime. You'll be familiar with this effect if you've played Retribution Paladin and Cataclysm. What this will do is, first of all, cause our abilities that generate Holy Power to deal 30% additional damage and healing. So Holy Shock is going to get 30% more healing from this, as well as Radiance. Because Radiance will generate a Holy Power, it will also do 30% more healing while this ability is up. But its most important effect is that for the whole 18-second duration, every single ability that would generate 1 Holy Power instead generates 3. And so if we perfectly alternate like builders with spenders, we should be getting anywhere from like 14 to 16 net Holy Power from this effect, depending on our haste, which is very powerful. You can see if I pop this, my Holy Shock is going to give me 3, my Crusader Strike is going to give me 3, even my Flash Heal on a beacon target is going to give me 3, and you can just alternate between Holy Shock, Crusader Strike, and Flash Heal, and every single global get a 3 Holy Power spender. So while you might think you want to spam 30% boosted Radiances here, I do think the 2 extra Holy Power is significantly more valuable than 30% extra on a Radiance. So you generically should not be casting Radiance inside of Holy Avenger unless you have an Infusion proc. Otherwise, you do want to be alternating between builders and using the maximum amount of 3 Holy Power spenders. So that's Holy Avenger. Next we have Sanctified Wrath. This will modify our Wings ability, causing it to last 50% longer. So it'll be a 30-second duration instead of a 20-second duration. And we'll also modify some of our abilities spec by spec. So for Holy, what this will do is reduce the cooldown of Holy Shock by 50%, and increase the critical strike chance of Holy Shock by 20%. This is on top of its already 25% base crit, plus, 5% from raid buff, so we can very quickly get to super high levels of crit with Holy Shock with this Sanctified Wrath buff. You can see even with my relatively low haste here, if I stack Wings with Guardian of Ancient Kings, I can get my Holy Shock cooldown to 2.6 seconds, which is quite low. And again, that critical strike is also going to radically increase the amount of infusion procs we get, allowing us to alternate between Radiance and Holy Shock very effectively to generate huge amounts of AoE healing and holy power. The problem with Sanctified Wrath is that I think it's just much weaker overall than Holy Avenger, plus modifying a pre-existing cooldown rather than giving us access to a second cooldown is a little bit weaker in that Holy Avenger will allow us to have more coverage where we can choose to split this up with Wings or stack it with Wings or any of our other cooldowns. Our last option on the row here is Divine Purpose. This says abilities that cost Holy Power have a 25% chance to cause Divine Purpose, which will make our next Holy Power spender free and proc as if it had 3 Holy Power. So if you just look at this tooltip, you might think to yourself, oh, can we like fish for extra value on this by using 1 Holy Power spenders on like Eternal Flame Hots or something? The answer to that is unfortunately no. There is a hidden modifier here where if you use 1 Holy Power, you only have like an 8.3% chance to proc. If you use 2, it's 16.6, and then only at 3 do you get the full 25%. This can, however, proc from itself, which gives it very slightly higher value. So this is going to give you like a little bit more than 25% extra healing on spenders. However, to be even remotely competitive with something like Holy Avenger, it's going to have to give you more than like 14 to 16 extra holy power on average every 2 minutes, which it just really doesn't. Plus, it has the natural downside of being totally random. And so if you can choose to not have something random and have something more deterministic like Holy Avenger and Sanctified Wrath, it's going to on average be better, right? So Divine Purpose would have to be significantly better in terms of overall throughput than the other 2 options to even be considered, and it just isn't. If you look at our estimated gain for each talent here, for Eternal Flame, we're getting about like 5 to 6% healing from Wrath, we're getting about 5% from Divine Purpose, and we're getting 12 to 13% from Holy Avenger, so more than double the other 2 options. And it's a similar story for Selfless Healer, where we're getting about 5% from Sanctified Wrath, a little bit worse on Divine Purpose just because LOD is a little bit less impactful than Eternal Flame, whereas we're getting like an 8 to 9% increase from Holy Avenger. Holy Avenger is just by far and away better, and given the fact that it's both higher raw HPS as well as a separate cooldown, which you can use for coverage if you want to, and purely deterministic compared to something like Divine Purpose, I would just never not take this in really any environment. However, if you don't care about min-maxing and you want a passive option for EF, I would take Divine Purpose, and for Selfless Healer, I would take Sanctified Wrath, as you should be using your wings anyways, and Sanctified Wrath doesn't really require any like management or changes to your playstyle other than just pressing Holy Shock a lot, which you should be doing anyways. So lastly, here we have our 90 row. This is also going to be a throughput relevant row. However, there's really only 2 choices for raid in 99% of fights, and the decider here is going to be pretty straightforward. So first of all, we have Holy Prism. This is the only one on the row that has a mana cost, however its mana cost is very, very low. This is kind of a strange spell. It has 2 modes to it. One is if you target an enemy. What it will do if you target an enemy is do a little bit of single target damage to that enemy, and then radiate healing based on that damage to 5 nearby allies. Despite the fact that the tooltip doesn't tell you this, it will actually be amplified by damage amps. Also, if you do use this on a single target, it will do a little bit higher healing and do AoE damage. So you can see there if I use it on myself, it will do some AoE damage. Generically, you're going to be using this on an enemy to do AoE healing. However, like in dungeons, this is actually a pretty good option just to do some nice little damage. If we look at our HPM calculations, Holy Prism used on an enemy, so in the AoE healing mode, has almost double the HPM of Holy Shock, and also has a very, very high HPCT. The healing from Holy Prism will propagate through Beacon, although at the reduced AoE rate of 15%. And as you can see, the healing will also proc Mastery, so this does scale with like all of our statistics. Next we have Light's Hammer. This is a 1-minute cooldown, so a little bit longer than Holy Prism. It also has no mana cost, weirdly, even though this one does. I don't really know why they chose not to give this a mana cost, but again, its healing per mana is going to be infinite. It's just 1 global to put down, and it will radiate healing and damage to 6 targets within the range, and this lasts for 14 seconds. So generically, if you always Holy Prism in AoE, and your Light's Hammer like doesn't overheal, it's going to be doing about, more like 62% more healing overall, with Light's Hammer also being more global efficient. The two situations where you're going to take Holy Prism is one, if there's both damage amp and high healing requirements at the same time, or if the raid is going to be moving so much that you can't get full value out of Light's Hammer. As soon as you're only getting like 40 or 50% value out of Light's Hammer due to movement, you can safely swap to Holy Prism without really any loss. Our last option here is Execution Sentence. This is a 1-minute cooldown that will do heavy single target healing or single target damage over time. This is basically useless outside of the one fight where you want to do very focused burst single target healing, being Sulong. And even on fights where you do want to do focused tank healing, you're much better off taking one of the other two options and just using your single target spells to heal the tank instead. So for raid, you can effectively erase this from your mind for every fight except Sulong. So those are our talents. Now before I go through our priority list / rotation, I want to go through the glyphs because there's some stuff here that's actually going to affect how we play a little bit. So our first glyph here is Avenging Wrath. This is just going to give us a tiny amount of self-healing while our wings is up. This is going to be like a 0.2% increase with Sanctified Wrath and a 0.15 without Sanctified Wrath, increased over healing, so very negligible here. Our next glyph is Battle Healer. This is going to cause our Seal of Insight healing procs to not just heal us, but rather smart heal, but be reduced to 30% of their value. So even if we assume our insight on our player character is overhealing at 80%, and the new glyph won't overheal at all, we're only gaining like 0.1% increase, so I would just never take this glyph. Our next glyph is Beacon of Light. This is going to dramatically alter our play pattern and introduce kind of a fun little mini game that you can choose to min-max if you want to. This completely removes the GCD on Beacon of Light. So you can see if I take my beacon off my player character and I press beacon and instantly Holy Shock, I can do them in the same GCD. However, it still will have that 3-second cooldown. So what this will allow us to do is like micromanage our beacon. Every 3 seconds, we can swap our beacon to a new target completely for free. So if the tank is topped and any target in the raid is low, or perhaps the off tank is taking more damage, we can swap our beacon around to reduce our beacon overhealing. So this is our overall beacon healing for EF and SH, and this is the percent healing we gain if we reduce our beacon's overhealing by the number up here. So if we reduce beacon overhealing by 5% by playing this little minigame, we get almost 1% extra healing on EF. And if we reduce our beacon healing by 2%, we gain almost 4% overall healing from EF. So this is a massive, massive impact for our glyph. And I also think just the existence of this glyph makes the spec a lot more fun to play. So generically, I would like never take this glyph off. Next, we have Glyph of Blessed Life. This is a 50% chance to gain a charge of Holy Power whenever you are afflicted by a stun, fear, or immobilize effect. So in PvE, we're not really going to be proccing this that much, but if you proc it on cooldown, so for something like a PvP environment, it actually is a huge amount of healing. It's like almost 3.5% more healing. Next, we have our Blinding Light. This makes our Blinding Light knock down enemies. This is potentially useful for stops in like challenge mode or something, but generically not really useful for PvE. Denounce is like a meme DPS glyph. It makes our Holy Shocks reduce the cast time of our next Denounce. Devotion Aura is another PvP glyph. This makes it no longer affect party members, but reduces its cooldown by a minute. So really you're just using this for the kit community in arenas or PGs. Divine Plea. This causes our Divine Plea to return 50% less mana, but have a 50% shorter cooldown. Something I forgot to mention about Divine Plea in the cooldown section of the video is that this no longer reduces your healing done while it's active. So you don't have to worry about timing this. You can just send it on cooldown. It also baseline restores 12% of our mana, however, will start to scale with spirit after a certain breakpoint, which is about like 9,000 spirit. So if you get more than 9,000 spirit, you actually get about 30% more value from spirit for pressing Divine Plea on cooldown, but kind of irrelevant because we should never really be getting beyond that level of spirit anyways. So this is useless unless the fight duration allows you to get an extra plea in effectively, with this lowered cooldown, but generically I just wouldn't take this. Glyph of Divine Protection is a nice defensive option if the fight does a lot of physical damage, so something like Crush on Garrulon, you can take this. Divinity increases the cooldown of our Lay on Hands by 2 minutes, but causes it to give 10% of our maximum mana. So on any fight less than 10 minutes, this is not going to reduce our HPS at all because we won't get 2 uses of LOH anyways, so it's just going to give us 10% mana per fight. So on a 6-minute fight, this is about 1500 HPS or, 1% extra healing. However, if we pair this with Unbreakable Spirit, we can get our Lay on Hands to a 6-minute cooldown while still getting the mana back. So on like 7 to 8 minute fights, it's potentially useful. Next, we have Glyph of Flash of Light. This is a very, very interesting one. What this does is whenever we Flash of Light a target, it will increase our next heal done to that target within 7 seconds by 10%. There's 2 interesting interactions here. The first is that it will work with Execution Sentence. So you can see if I put this buff up, and Execution Sentence, the entire duration of this hot will get 10% amplification. So kind of strong there for specifically Sulong. The other thing we can do with this is that this will buff the entire duration of an Eternal Flame. So it's going to give 10% to both the initial healing as well as every single tick of this hot. Also, given the fact that Flash of Light on a beacon target is actually relatively mana efficient, if you add a 10% value to the next EF you put on that target to that cast as well, it makes it even more mana efficient. So if we look here at Flash of Light plus the Glyph, if we assume 10% value on an EF, our HPM on Flash of Light's up in like the 14-15 range, which is very, very high. And again, because we're running Glyph of Beacon of Light, this means that whenever we ever spot heal someone with Flash of Light, we can just always pre-swap Beacon to them before we flash with either a macro or just manually. So every time we flash heal, we will always be getting a holy power out of it, and we'll always be putting this buff up. So this Glyph overall is going to be a pretty powerful buff to our spot healing, especially for Eternal Flame. And it's also really nice for things like tank healing, where before you put a new Eternal Flame up on a tank, you can swap your beacon to them, flash heal, and then put your EF up to get just 10% extra value. While this Glyph is less valuable for Selfless Healer because we don't have Eternal Flame to amplify with it, it's still a slight upgrade to our Flash of Light efficiency, which is already quite good for spot healing, especially if we always swap our beacon to always get that holy power value out of every flash heal. Next, we have a very odd glyph called Glyph of Illumination. What this does is cause our Holy Shock critical strikes to grant 1% mana in return. So you can see I crit there and the Holy Shock returned 3000 mana. However, its downside is that we get 10% less mana from Holy Insight. Holy Insight is the passive that gives us our spirit regen. However, this does appear to be bugged on beta, where it's not reducing spirit regen, but rather just reducing our base regen of 6,000 by a flat 10%. I'm unsure what's Blizz like here, whether or not this is supposed to be affecting all of our regen, just base regen, or just spirit regen. If it does affect just spirit regen and not base regen, it's going to be a pretty similar math. However, if it affects both, it's going to be a little bit worse for this glyph. So I built this chart here to show us our gain in HPS at given levels of crit percentage from gear. So our crit percentage from shock is going to be like 30% higher, right? Because we have 5% from our raid buff and 25% flat from Holy Shock itself. So at 5% crit from gear, we have a 35% crit chance, for example. So our expected value on mana from each shock is just going to be our crit chance times 3000, right? And then we're going to be able to cast that Holy Shock every single CD of Holy Shock. So our MP5 from this expected value is going to be this divided by our shock CD times 5. This is assuming we have like perfect CPM on Holy Shock, so this is actually going to be a little bit lower in reality. And then our net gain in MP5 is just going to be this minus the 600 that we lose off of our base regen. So in this situation, even at only 5% crit from gear, we're still getting 1% HPS from this glyph. And up higher here at like 20% crit in our gear, we're gaining 2% HPS. However, this is contingent on it being bugged. If this is supposed to affect just spirit regen, the number should be similar. But if it's supposed to affect both spirit regen and base regen, we're going to be losing more like 1000 MP5 here, in which case, you know, at 5% crit, we're only getting 0.25, and at 20% crit, we're only getting about 1%. So a very strange one there, kind of hard to evaluate how good it is. However, before we have access to Hand of Sack, I think it might actually be a decent take. Next, we have Glyph of Light of Dawn. This causes our LOD to affect 2 fewer targets, but heal each target for 25% more. This is only an upgrade if you can't consistently hit 5 LOD, so like even in 5-mans, you should be consistently hitting 5. So I would just never take this glyph, honestly, unless you're like in arenas 3s or something, but in those arenas settings, I don't think you're pressing LOD. Next, we have Protector of the Innocent. This causes our Word of Glory to heal us for 20% of the amount if we use it to heal another target. So you can see if I heal this guard here, it's going to heal me for 20% of the amount plus beacon. Notably, this does not affect the hot of EF, but it does affect the direct heal. Assuming we are playing EF, this will be about a 1% raw HPS increase. Obviously, some of this is going to overheal, and it will compete with like our Seal of Insight healing and stuff like that. So realistically, it should be more like a 0.5% increase, so not a great glyph. It also doesn't affect Eternal Flames we put on ourself, and given the fact that Eternal Flame is 50% amped on the hot if we use it on ourself, generally speaking, we want to be rolling an EF on our own player character if there's rot in the fight where we're taking damage. Our last 2 glyphs here are not going to be available because they are 5.4 patch glyphs. The first, Divine Shield, heals us for 10% for each debuff we remove with our bubble. This is really good for PvP, but not super valuable for PvE. The last glyph here is actually incredibly valuable for PvE, and once we have access to this, we'll be running this basically all the time. What this does is causes our Hand of Sack to no longer redirect damage to us. So we no longer have to do things like bubble sack if the tank is going to take huge damage. We can just send our Hand of Sack whenever we want. So what is our glyph setup going to look like? I would always keep Beacon of Light on no matter what. If you play EF, I would definitely run Flash of Light. For SH, it's a little bit less important. You can replace it with a utility or a defensive glyph. For fights that are physical, you want to put Divine Protection on. Beyond that, all the other HPS glyphs are going to be very similar. Glyph of Divinity and Protector of the Innocent, all offering very similar levels of overall HPS increase. So it's really personal preference. However, again, once we do have access to this hand sack glyph, you want to put this on basically all the time. Alright, so finally we can get to our priority list. So our first priority is going to be in Seal of Insight. 5% healing, 10% spell haste, all the mana and healing you get from this, just kind of irreplaceable. And the damage you get from these other two seals is just going to be like tiny and never worth it. That's really our maintenance buff. Obviously our blessings are going to be maintenance buffs, but in a raid environment, you probably are going to be getting these blessings from some other source. Our number one priority for healing is always going to be to use our cooldowns. Obviously we want to try not to overlap these with other healers while still getting the maximum casts. All of our major cooldowns being 3 minutes means again we can stack these for incredible burst. Generally speaking, you're going to be spreading these out for more coverage. One thing to mention here is that if you do take Holy Avenger with Eternal Flame, you can use this to pre-blanket a huge amount of Eternal Flames on the raid just before damage comes out. So if we have a damage instance that, for example, lasts 10 seconds, you can pop your Holy Avenger 8 seconds before, get a couple of hots out to blanket the raid, and then have that cooldown up during the damage instance as well. Our next highest priority is to keep our beacon on the optimal target. Because this is off GCD, this is kind of like a separate priority list because it won't interfere with the casting of any of our on GCD buttons. We can always be looking for opportunities on our raid frames at all times to swap our beacon. Next on our priority list is going to be our 90 row. So this is, Light's Hammer and Holy Prism. Both of these buttons are incredibly efficient and very high HPS, so you definitely want to keep these on cooldown as our highest priority. After we send our 90 row on cooldown, we want to be highly prioritizing never overcapping on Holy Power. If we waste a charge of Holy Power, that's generally worse than just overhealing at a higher percentage on an EF or an LOD. Our next priority is Holy Shock. This is very high priority for both SH and EF, as well as, Sacred Shield. If we're playing Selfless Healer, Judgment is going to be just below Holy Shock, also generating Holy Power as well as stacks of our Selfless Healer buff. Another thing to mention here, similar to overcapping Holy Power, is we don't want to ever overcap on our Selfless Healer buff. So if you get to 3 stacks, definitely send a Radiance or a DL before you use another Judgment. So that's it. Those are all of our cooldowns that we have to manage here. So pretty simple priority list here. For our spot healing, we always want to swap Beacon to the target before we hit them with a Flash of Light or a Divine Light, because the extra Holy Power we get from Tower of Radiance is far more valuable than the 50% transfer through Beacon that we're going to get. When it comes to spot healing, I would prioritize Flash of Light. It's slightly less efficient, but just much higher HPS than Divine Light, unless we have Infusion, in which case Divine Light's quite strong. If we take Eternal Flame itself is quite a powerful spot heal. However, you never want to Eternal Flame someone that already has the Hot active, which makes it a little bit weaker and less versatile as a spot heal. For our filler, we want to prioritize Crusader Strike as well as keeping our melee uptime for the mana from Seal of Insight. This is much better for Eternal Flame, however, even for SH, Crusader Strike is worth casting for LOD, as well as, again, for that mana and melee uptime. If we're forced into range of the boss, or we need a little bit higher HPS than just Crusader Strike will afford us, for our AoE filler, we just want to spam Holy Radiance. And for a single target filler, we can either spam Flash of Light or Divine Light always into our beacon target. And again, because the HPS and HPM of our Divine Light and Flash of Light into our beacon target are relatively high, if our Radiance is going to overheal at 70%, it can be correct to actually just spam your single target spells into the tank, assuming they won't overheal. But generally in 90% of situations, Radiance is going to be a much better filler than our single target spells. So that's it, that's the rotation, really pretty simple, honestly. Alright, so I'm going to go over stat weights really quickly here. So I have a Selfless Healer stat weight here and an Eternal Flame stat weight here. I didn't bother to do one for Sacred Shield, but it should be very similar to SH, just with a little bit less intellect scaling. These stat weights are based on a loose Phase 1 BIS setup. If you want to find your own, you can just put your gear statistics in here and use the calculate function. However, the ratios here should be relatively similar for most gear levels. So for Selfless Healer, interestingly enough, Mastery is actually worth more than Intellect 2 to 1, even at this low gear level, so you want to be gemming for Mastery. Crit is our second best stat, Spirit being our third best, and Haste is actually last. So despite the fact that Haste is going to reduce the cooldown on both Holy Shock and Judgment, which are our two like primary builders, all that really does is make our Holy Power generation a little bit more efficient, and Haste does not scale the healing on any of our filler spells or any of our like short cooldowns like our 90 row stuff, so Haste just ends up being quite poor for SH. EF, however, is another story. It still has similar intellect scaling, but its mastery scaling is actually much worse. Even though Eternal Flame now benefits from mastery, Selfless Healer is just going to do a lot more direct healing, a lot more radiance healing, and a lot less of its healing is going to be Beacon, which doesn't benefit from mastery. So for Eternal Flame between breakpoints, we end up having Crit as our number one stat, Spirit as second, and Mastery is a very close third to Spirit. Haste between breakpoints is very, very low value, basically just decreasing the cooldown of Holy Shock primarily and CS secondarily, but the value of Haste is significantly increased if we do make breakpoints with EFs. From 0 to our first breakpoint at 13 ticks, we get about like 2.4 weight for Haste, so a little bit worse than Crit still, kind of similar to Spirit. Our 14 tick breakpoint at about 7200 is worth 3.35 though, so to this breakpoint, Haste is by far our best stat and is actually worth more than Intellect. And the same holds true for both our 15 and 16 tick breakpoints, so until we can get this 14 point, we don't really care too much about our first breakpoint, although if we do get some haste in our gear, we want to get this anyways. But after that 13 tick breakpoint, we're really incentivized to go for the 14, 15, and 16 breakpoint with EF, which is a little bit unfortunate given that SH really doesn't care about haste at all, so you kind of do want to have two separate gear sets if you're going to swap between styles here, with a Mastery Crit set for SH and a High Haste Crit Spirit set for EF. When it comes to meta gems for both specs, Crit is about a 0.5% increase, with the mana gem being slightly better for EF at 0.28 and 0.24 for Selfless Healer, so we kind of just always want to go Crit meta. For red and yellow sockets, for SH we want like Mastery or Mastery Int gems, and for blue we want Int Spirit or Mastery Spirit for SH. For EF we want Int Spirit and Int/Int Haste. However, if we are like in these breakpoints where haste is worth more than intellect, you might want to just gem pure haste to make these breakpoints if possible. For professions, we of course want engineering for nitro boots as well as the Priebus helm. Our second profession should either be leatherworking for drums of speed or blacksmithing for access to pure haste gem sockets for EF haste breakpoints or pure mastery gems for selfless healer. When it comes to racials, there's not that many options, especially for Horde. We have Tauren, which is just useless garbage, a little bit of HP and War Stomp. And then Blood Elf, which is going to give us a little tiny bit of MP5, so it's going to be a decent amount of HPS. Definitely go Blood Elf if you're Horde. For Alliance, we have Human, which is 3% Spirit and some Expertise. The Expertise will actually affect your Crusader Strike, but it's like tiny amount, like 1% increase to the healing of CS, so not hugely important. The Spirit is of course going to vary based on how much Spirit you have on your gear, but considering that Spirit's a decently valuable statistic for us, it should be worth like, maybe 0.2% extra healing. Dwarf is just like a useless PvP race, except Human's better for PvP anyways. And Draenei has Gift of the Naru, which is a tiny amount of HPS. By default though, for Alliance I would just go Human. For our consumables, we're of course always going to take Intellect Flask and Intellect Food. For our potions, we're really choosing between Intellect Potion and our Mana Potion. Potion of Focus is never worth doing because instead of sitting, you can be meleeing and generating way more mana than you'd ever get in that 10 seconds from the Potion of Focus. The overall HPS between Mana Potion and Intellect Potion are probably relatively close, however the ability to stack Intellect Potion with some of our 3 minutes to do really high burst HPS is going to be situationally useful. However, if you don't want to like min-max your Intellect Potion usage, you can just use Master Mana Potion and you won't be really losing anything. If you use Alchemist Stone, this will make Mana Potion a little bit better, obviously. For our Priebus, I think Alchemist Stone is actually going to be really strong. I think you just pair this with like the Healer Darkmoon card. One last thing to mention for Priebus gearing here is that our PvP set bonuses are actually very strong for HPAL. The 2 sets, 10% more healing from Holy Shock, which is only about a 2% healing increase, but still quite significant. And the 4 set gives us 1 extra Holy Power on our Flash of Lights, which is actually incredibly strong. Pair this with Tower of Radiance and your Flash of Light is generating 2 Holy Power, in which case it has an almost 18 HPM for EF, or 20 including the Glyph amp. So it's very likely that for Priebus for MSV, we actually want to be running 4 set PvP. So something to keep an eye out for. Definitely you want to be farming however much Conquest we have access to pre-raid. So before I sign off here, I want to talk a little bit about UI. First of all, not a lot of stuff to track for Holy Paladin on your raid frames, honestly. Although you want to have a very obvious Eternal Flame indicator because it's pretty bad to cast Eternal Flame on somebody that already has the hot on them. So something that's very obvious that will show you who does and doesn't have the hot on them at a glance is very useful. Also, it can be useful to track other healers' passive tank healing, so things like Earth Shield, Riptide, Life Bloom, so that you can prioritize your beacon on the target that's taking the most damage and also gaining the least passive healing from your other healers. Little small optimizations like that, especially for Eternal Flame, where beacon is going to be so much of your healing, will be hugely impactful to your HPS as well as your tank and off-tank survivability. When it comes to macros, there's really not a lot of stuff to talk about here that's too fancy. Just a reminder to have all your stuff either clickcast or mouse over macroed. When it comes to weak ores, anything that shows your major cooldowns centrally located in your screen as well as your holy power and mana bar will function just fine. So that's it, that's the guide. If you enjoyed or learned something, like, subscribe. If you have any questions, you can always comment below or ask them in the Discord server. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.